They flogged a queen in public. They violated her daughters. And they believed the humiliation of one Celtic dynasty would silence an entire island. In the first century of the Common Era, the Roman Empire did not merely conquer territory. It absorbed it, reorganized it, taxed it, and rewrote its power structures with cold, administrative precision. When Roman authority expanded into Britannia after the invasion of 43 CE under Emperor Claudius, it did so with legions, engineers, surveyors, and financiers. Fortresses rose along river valleys. Roads cut through forests that had never known straight lines. Tribal kings were not immediately removed. Many were transformed into client rulers, bound to Rome by treaty, tribute, and calculated dependency. Among those rulers was Prasutagus, king of the Iceni in eastern Britannia. His people had initially resisted Roman expansion, but eventually reached accommodation. As a client king, Prasutagus retained nominal authority while acknowledging Roman supremacy. The arrangement was practical. Rome avoided the cost of direct occupation in unstable frontier zones, and local elites preserved status under imperial oversight. But client kingship was fragile. It depended on Roman goodwill and the absence of administrative greed. When Prasutagus died around 60 CE, he attempted a compromise that reflected both caution and fear. According to the Roman historian Tacitus, he left his kingdom jointly to his two daughters and to the Roman emperor, likely Nero. This was not generosity toward Rome. It was an attempt to shield his family and tribe from annexation. In Celtic society, female inheritance was not unthinkable. In Roman law, however, sovereignty could not pass to women in the same way, and joint rule with an emperor was legally meaningless within imperial frameworks. Roman officials in Britannia treated the will not as partnership, but as opportunity. The kingdom was annexed outright. Imperial procurators moved in to claim assets. Wealth was seized under the pretext of debt collection. Aristocrats were stripped of property. The Iceni elite, once allies, were reduced to subjects overnight. In this transition from client kingdom to province, the violence was not incidental. It was instrumental. Boudica, widow of Prasutagus, was publicly flogged. Her daughters were raped by Roman soldiers. Tacitus, writing decades later, presents this not as rumor, but as cause. While his account reflects Roman elite perspective and political messaging, the administrative brutality he describes aligns with broader imperial practice. Rome enforced compliance through exemplary punishment. Humiliation was policy. The psychological rupture was immediate. Roman authority had rested on a combination of military superiority and negotiated legitimacy. By assaulting a royal family that had not rebelled, Roman officials demonstrated that treaty and loyalty offered no protection. For the Iceni and neighboring tribes, this was not merely a local grievance. It was proof that the imperial system could turn predatory without warning. Boudica emerged not as a symbolic widow, but as a rallying leader in a moment of structural breakdown. Ancient sources describe her as tall, with a harsh voice and long tawny hair. Such details reflect Roman ethnographic stereotypes of northern peoples, yet they underscore the shock Roman observers felt at a woman commanding a coalition army. Her authority likely derived from dynastic legitimacy combined with collective outrage. She was not inventing rebellion. She was channeling it. The timing was decisive. The Roman governor, Gaius Suetonius Paulinus, was campaigning in northwest Wales against the Druids on the island of Mona, modern Anglesey. This campaign targeted religious and cultural centers that Rome viewed as incubators of resistance. With much of the provincial military strength concentrated there, Eastern Britannia was exposed. Boudica and her allies understood the vacuum. The revolt that followed was not a chaotic riot. It was a coordinated uprising involving the Iceni, the Trinovants, and other disaffected groups. Their first major target was Camulodunum, modern Colchester, a Roman colony settled by veterans. The settlement symbolized occupation. A temple to the deified Claudius dominated the city, funded in part by local tribute. To Britons, it was a monument to subjugation. Archaeological evidence confirms widespread destruction. Layers of ash and debris correspond to the sack described by Tacitus and Cassius Dio. The Roman inhabitants, lacking substantial defenses, were overwhelmed. The temple complex became a final refuge before falling. The revolt moved with speed, fueled by accumulated resentment against land seizures and veteran encroachment. Suetonius Paulinus marched back from Wales as rapidly as terrain allowed. He reached Londinium, a growing commercial center but not yet fortified. Assessing his limited forces, he made a ruthless calculation. He evacuated those who could follow and abandoned the city to its fate. Londinium was burned. Verulamium, another settlement with Roman ties, suffered the same destruction. Tacitus estimates that tens of thousands of Romans and Romanized Britons were killed. Ancient casualty figures are often exaggerated, but the scale of devastation was real. For Rome, this was no minor disturbance. It was a provincial catastrophe. The rebellion exposed how thin imperial control could be beyond fortified lines. Roads and towns did not guarantee submission. The legions were formidable in battle, but they could not be everywhere at once. Yet the Roman response would be methodical. Suetonius gathered what forces he could, including the 14th Legion and detachments of the 20th. He chose ground carefully for the decisive confrontation, likely along Watling Street. Narrow defile protected his flanks. Discipline would compensate for numbers. Boudica's coalition, by contrast, relied on mass mobilization. Warriors brought families and wagons, forming a vast assembly behind the lines. This suggests confidence, even expectation of total victory. It also constrained maneuverability. Celtic warfare emphasized ferocity and shock, but against a tightly organized Roman formation, cohesion would determine survival. When the final battle came, Roman tactics prevailed. The legions advanced in wedge formation, throwing pila to disrupt charges, then closing with short swords in controlled ranks. The Britons, compressed and unable to retreat due to their own wagon barricade, were cut down in large numbers. Tacitus reports staggering casualties among the rebels, though precise figures remain uncertain. Boudica did not fall in combat. Ancient sources state that she took poison to avoid capture. Whether this detail reflects fact or Roman literary convention, it indicates one certainty: she was not paraded in chains through Rome. Her rebellion ended not with public execution, but with disappearance into death and memory. The immediate aftermath was severe. Roman reprisals were harsh. Lands were confiscated. Surveillance intensified. Yet Rome also learned. Excessive financial exploitation had triggered the uprising. Procuratorial abuses were moderated. Administrative reforms followed, not from mercy, but from strategic recalibration. The brutality inflicted upon Boudica's family had been intended as a warning. Instead, it ignited the most serious provincial revolt of Nero's reign. The punishment meant to secure obedience nearly fractured Roman control of Britannia entirely, and Rome would not forget how close it had come to losing the island. The Roman victory did not restore calm. It restored control. Control, in the Roman system, required demonstration. Rebellion could not simply be defeated. It had to be cauterized. After the defeat of Boudica's coalition along Watling Street, the landscape of Eastern Britannia was not pacified ground. It was a zone of punitive occupation. Gaius Suetonius Paulinus understood that mercy would be interpreted as weakness. His immediate measures were retributive and strategic. Tacitus records that the Roman army pursued remnants of the rebel force relentlessly. Villages suspected of support were burned. Crops were destroyed. The objective was not solely revenge. It was deterrence through deprivation. By stripping the countryside of resources, the Romans ensured that no secondary uprising could gather momentum before winter. Yet even in victory, Rome recognized danger. The rebellion had erupted not in a remote tribal enclave, but in regions previously considered stable. Client arrangements had failed. Financial extraction had provoked revolt. The imperial administration had misjudged both cultural resilience and the limits of humiliation. The psychological impact on Roman leadership was significant. News of the uprising reached the imperial court during Nero's reign, a period already marked by internal instability and suspicion. A province lost at the edge of the empire would signal vulnerability. The rebellion had destroyed 3 major settlements and annihilated thousands of Roman citizens and allies. The possibility of abandoning Britannia altogether was reportedly considered in Rome. That option was rejected, not because the island was indispensable economically, but because imperial prestige could not endure visible retreat. Prestige was currency. In the months following the suppression, Roman forces intensified their presence. Additional troops were requested. Reinforcements from the continent stabilized the frontier. The lesson was clear: indirect governance without sufficient military backing invited catastrophe. The experiment of light oversight through client kingship was effectively over in Eastern Britannia. Boudica herself vanished from the historical record after her death. No confirmed burial site exists. No contemporary British source preserves her perspective. What survives comes through Roman historians writing decades later, each shaped by their own political environment. Tacitus, whose father-in-law Agricola would later govern Britannia, presented the revolt partly as evidence of corrupt provincial administration under Nero. Cassius Dio, writing in the 3rd century, dramatized certain details but reinforced the core narrative of provocation and mass violence. The absence of indigenous records is not surprising. Celtic societies of Britannia relied heavily on oral tradition. Roman conquest disrupted those networks. Druids, who functioned as religious authorities and custodians of cultural memory, had already been targeted during Paulinus's campaign in Mona. With their suppression, the continuity of pre-Roman elite narrative fractured. Roman literacy replaced native memory in the written archive. This imbalance shaped how Boudica's punishment was understood. In Roman texts, the flogging and assault of her daughters appear as inciting incidents, almost narrative catalysts. But within Celtic frameworks, such acts would have been more than personal outrage. They represented a ritualized stripping of sovereignty. The body of the queen became a symbol of tribal autonomy violated. Her daughter's assault signaled dynastic erasure. In societies where lineage legitimized authority, that was existential. Roman administrators likely did not perceive the act in those terms. Public corporal punishment was embedded in their disciplinary culture. Slaves were whipped. Soldiers were beaten for infractions. Subordinate elites who resisted could be humiliated to reinforce hierarchy. What occurred in Iceni territory may have been seen by officials as enforcement of fiscal claims. They underestimated the symbolic threshold they crossed. After the revolt, Rome recalibrated its administrative tone. The procurator Catus Decianus, whose aggressive debt collection had fueled resentment, fled to Gaul during the uprising. His failure underscored the risk of unchecked financial exploitation. Subsequent fiscal policy in Britannia became more regulated. Tribute continued, but overt confiscations diminished. Rome preferred predictable revenue to destabilizing greed. Military infrastructure expanded rapidly. Fortresses were reinforced. Road networks extended deeper into contested regions, allowing faster troop movement. The construction was not merely logistical. It projected permanence. Stone replaced timber in key settlements, signaling that Roman presence was no longer provisional. The colony at Camulodunum was rebuilt. Londinium, despite its destruction, re-emerged as a commercial hub. Urban reconstruction followed Roman grid planning, imposing geometric order on previously organic settlements. Markets reopened. Trade resumed. Economic integration became a secondary mechanism of control. Yet beneath the reconstruction lay a hardened policy. Tribal elites were more carefully vetted. Hostages were sometimes taken as guarantees of loyalty. Diplomatic language persisted, but the memory of rebellion shadowed every negotiation. Rome would tolerate local customs, but only within a framework of visible submission. The defeat of Boudica also carried implications for gender and power in Roman perception. A woman leading a massive insurgency unsettled Roman writers. Their descriptions often emphasize her physicality, her voice, her presence before troops. These portrayals reflect both fascination and discomfort. In Roman ideology, women wielding military authority inverted normative order. The fact that such leadership nearly shattered provincial control reinforced anxieties about disorder beyond Roman civilization. But Rome did not alter its gender policies because of her. The empire had encountered female rulers before, particularly in eastern client kingdoms. What changed was not Roman view of women broadly, but Roman vigilance regarding client arrangements in volatile regions. Strategically, the rebellion delayed further expansion northward. Consolidation took precedence over ambition. It would take decades before Roman forces pushed deeper into what is now northern England and Scotland. The uprising demonstrated that occupation required layered security: military, economic, and psychological. Psychological dominance became central. Public executions of captured rebels likely occurred, though detailed records are sparse. Displays of Roman discipline were deliberate. Marching formations, fortified camps, standardized armor, all projected inevitability. Rome's strength was not only in combat efficiency, but in the impression that resistance was futile. Over time, Britannia did not remain in constant rebellion. Many tribes adapted. Roman citizenship was gradually extended to local elites. Trade networks enriched certain regions. Villas appeared in the countryside, blending Roman architecture with local adaptation. Cultural assimilation did not erase memory of revolt, but it diluted its immediacy. The brutality inflicted on Boudica's family had failed as a preventive measure. Yet the subsequent Roman response succeeded in preventing large-scale insurrection for generations. Fear, infrastructure, and administrative reform combined into a durable system. Still, the rebellion exposed a structural truth about empire. Conquest was not a single event. It was an ongoing negotiation enforced by violence. When that violence exceeded perceived bounds of legitimacy, even dominant powers could trigger unified resistance among divided peoples. In suppressing Boudica's uprising, Rome preserved Britannia, but it also revealed how fragile imperial authority could become when arrogance replaced calculation. The island would remain Roman for centuries, but it would never again be underestimated. In the years after the revolt, the Roman presence in Britannia hardened into something less experimental and more absolute. What had once been a frontier venture became a structured occupation zone shaped by caution, surveillance, and calculated integration. The memory of mass slaughter at Camulodunum, Londinium, and Verulamium did not fade within the administrative ranks, nor did the image of legionaries nearly overwhelmed by a coalition they had dismissed as fragmented tribes. Rome responded not with theatrical cruelty, but with systemic reinforcement. The governorship of Suetonius Paulinus did not last long after the suppression. Though victorious, his severity raised concerns in Rome. Tacitus suggests that imperial authorities feared his punitive campaigns might reignite instability. He was replaced by Publius Petronius Turpilianus, whose approach emphasized stabilization over retribution. This transition was not a moral pivot. It was strategic recalibration. Excessive punishment risked creating martyrs. Controlled absorption promised durability. Military distribution across the province shifted. Rome did not merely occupy Britannia after the revolt. It engineered its permanence. The decades following Boudica's defeat marked a transformation from reactive control to calculated consolidation. Imperial authority, once shaken, embedded itself into the geography of the island with deliberate precision. Fortifications multiplied. Administrative boundaries hardened. Britannia ceased to be a volatile annex and became an organized frontier province with layered defenses and integrated command. Under governors succeeding Suetonius Paulinus, expansion resumed cautiously. Campaigns into northern territories were not impulsive thrusts, but structured advances supported by fortified supply lines. By the late 1st century, under governors such as Agricola, Roman forces pushed deeper into Caledonia, Tacitus, writing partly in praise of Agricola, describes systematic fort-building and coordinated offensives designed to fragment tribal coalitions before they could coalesce into another Boudican-scale uprising. This strategy reflected a core lesson. Unity among disparate tribes posed greater danger than any single warband. The earlier rebellion had proven how quickly shared grievance could override internal rivalries. Rome, therefore, aimed to prevent broad alliances by isolating resistance geographically and politically. Forts were positioned to monitor movement corridors. River crossings and high ground were secured. Communication between tribal regions became easier for Rome and more difficult for potential insurgents. Military architecture conveyed permanence. Legionary fortresses evolved from timber to stone, signaling that Rome did not anticipate withdrawal. These installations were self-contained cities housing thousands of soldiers with workshops, granaries, and hospitals. Their presence reshaped surrounding landscapes. Civilian settlements, or vici, formed around them, populated by traders, craftsmen, and families linked economically to the garrisons. Economic integration accelerated alongside militarization. Roman coinage circulated widely, embedding imperial imagery into daily exchange. Markets tied local producers to continental demand. Roads connected agricultural zones to urban centers, facilitating taxation and trade simultaneously. Economic participation became both incentive and leash. Prosperity reduced appetite for revolt, while dependence on Roman networks increased cost of rebellion. Legal transformation followed. Roman law gradually intersected with tribal customs. Dispute resolution, property rights, and inheritance increasingly passed through imperial frameworks. Local elites who cooperated could obtain Roman citizenship, a powerful tool of social elevation. Citizenship did not erase identity, but it aligned personal advancement with imperial stability. The memory of Boudica's punishment lingered in quieter forms. While Roman sources focus on the uprising's violence, the original humiliation of the Iceni royal family remained embedded in collective consciousness. Public flogging of a queen was not merely disciplinary. It was symbolic annihilation of sovereignty. The Romans likely intended it as a demonstration of unquestioned dominance. Instead, it exposed the volatility of dishonor. In subsequent decades, Roman administrators displayed greater caution in handling allied elites. While coercion remained available, overt humiliation of cooperative rulers diminished. Imperial governance favored absorption through hierarchy rather than spectacle of degradation. The revolt had revealed that symbolic violence against leadership could galvanize rather than suppress. Militarily, Rome refined counterinsurgency approaches across the empire, partly informed by frontier experiences like Britannia. Rapid response mobility became doctrine. Auxiliary units recruited from distant provinces, Batavians, Thracians, and others, served in Britannia, reducing local sympathies within the ranks. Diversity within the army strengthened loyalty to Rome rather than region. By the early 2nd century, Britannia appeared stabilized enough to permit architectural ambition on unprecedented scale. The construction of Hadrian's Wall beginning in 122 CE under Emperor Hadrian marked a decisive shift from expansion to boundary definition. Though built decades after Boudica's revolt, the wall embodied accumulated lessons. Control required clarity of limits. Rather than endless conquest into Caledonia, Rome chose fortified demarcation. The wall was not solely a barrier against northern tribes. It regulated movement, trade, and taxation. Gates functioned as controlled checkpoints. Surveillance replaced unpredictable confrontation. The empire preferred defined edges to fluid frontiers. Culturally, Romano-British identity emerged gradually. Mosaic floors depicted classical motifs within villas built on lands once ravaged by revolt. Latin inscriptions commemorated local officials with Celtic names serving in Roman capacities. Religious syncretism flourished. Deities were paired across pantheons, blending iconography without erasing origin. Such synthesis represented adaptation, not surrender. Yet beneath surface integration lay an undercurrent of dual memory. Rome remembered the cost of arrogance. Britons remembered the cost of defiance. This mutual awareness shaped a tense equilibrium. Open rebellion on the scale of 60 to 61 CE did not recur in southern Britannia, but localized resistance persisted intermittently, particularly in northern regions where Roman control remained less culturally entrenched. Imperial policy across the 2nd century emphasized steady governance over dramatic conquest. Britannia's garrisons remained substantial relative to its economic output, underscoring the province's strategic sensitivity. Its distance from Rome meant that reinforcement required significant logistical effort. Stability was therefore maintained proactively rather than reactively. The long-term geopolitical impact of Boudica's revolt extended beyond the island. It reinforced in Roman strategic thought that peripheral provinces required layered integration: military, economic, cultural, and symbolic. Conquest alone was insufficient. Respect, carefully calibrated and backed by force, proved more sustainable than humiliation. In this transformation, the figure of Boudica became paradoxical within Roman literature. She was depicted as fierce, formidable, yet ultimately defeated by disciplined order. Her rebellion was framed as both cautionary and confirmatory, a warning against administrative excess and an affirmation of Roman military superiority. For Britannia, the consequences were irreversible. The Iceni never regained independent sovereignty. Their territory dissolved into provincial structure. Dynastic continuity ended not in ceremonial absorption, but in obliteration. The daughters whose assault ignited revolt disappear from record entirely, absorbed into silence. Their fate beyond the uprising remains unknown, a reminder of how empire consumes individual histories. The Roman system endured on the island for nearly 4 centuries. Roads outlasted legions. Urban grids persisted long after imperial withdrawal. The scars of rebellion became layers beneath new construction. Ash turned to foundation. But the event itself remained a hinge moment. It forced Rome to confront the limits of intimidation. It reshaped governance from opportunistic annexation to fortified permanence. It altered how empire perceived the psychology of subjected elites. The punishment inflicted on Boudica had been designed to end resistance before it began. Instead, it redrew the architecture of Roman power in Britannia. The transformation of Britannia after the revolt did not eliminate violence. It reorganized it. Rome's authority in the province rested on an implicit calculation. The cost of resistance must always exceed the burden of submission. After Boudica's defeat, that calculation became more systematic. Force was no longer improvised through humiliation of allied elites. It was embedded in infrastructure, law, and constant military visibility. In the immediate generation following the uprising, the Roman army in Britannia remained proportionally large compared to other Western provinces. 3 legions were stationed on the island for much of the late 1st century, supported by numerous auxiliary cohorts. This density was not accidental. It reflected a conscious decision to overmatch potential unrest. The memory of burned colonies and massacred civilians had altered imperial risk tolerance. Yet military presence alone could not secure long-term stability. The empire required local collaboration. Roman governors therefore cultivated a new class of provincial intermediaries. Britons educated in Roman administrative practices, fluent in Latin, invested in imperial order. These figures acted as translators between tribal heritage and Roman law. Their loyalty was incentivized through land grants, citizenship, and integration into broader imperial networks. The shift in governance strategy after the revolt can be observed archaeologically. Elite residences in southeastern Britannia began to adopt Roman architectural forms more consistently. Courtyard villas replaced traditional roundhouses among upper strata. Imported pottery and luxury goods appeared in greater quantities. Such material culture signals participation in Roman economic circuits rather than coerced occupation alone. However, this integration was uneven. Rural communities beyond major roads retained indigenous lifeways longer. Agricultural patterns continued according to local rhythms. Sacred landscapes, including groves and springs, remained spiritually significant even as Roman temples appeared nearby. Romanization in Britannia was layered, not uniform. The suppression of Druidic influence earlier under Suetonius Paulinus had disrupted religious leadership structures that once linked tribes across regions. Without a unifying priestly class capable of coordinating resistance, large-scale coalition became less likely. Religion, once a connective tissue for rebellion, fragmented under sustained surveillance and cultural dilution. The Roman state also refined its approach to taxation. Rather than sudden asset seizure, assessments became standardized. Census data facilitated predictable levies. Stability in revenue extraction reduced flashpoints of resentment. While taxation remained burdensome, it operated within clearer expectations. Predictability was itself a form of control. Psychologically, the example of Boudica functioned as a boundary marker. Her revolt demonstrated that Rome could be challenged, but also that challenge would end in overwhelming loss. For provincial elites, the lesson was pragmatic. Cooperation ensured survival and advancement. Rebellion promised obliteration. Across the empire, Britannia's near catastrophe reinforced an emerging pattern in frontier management. In provinces where local aristocracies were respected and gradually incorporated, resistance diminished. Where administrators resorted to sudden dispossession, volatility increased. This was not moral evolution, but strategic learning. By the early 2nd century, the province had achieved a form of tense equilibrium. Urban centers thrived. Trade routes connected Britannia to Gaul, Hispania, and beyond. Mining operations in Wales and northern regions contributed resources to imperial industry. Agricultural surplus fed both local populations and military garrisons. Economic self-sufficiency reduced reliance on continental shipments, strengthening resilience. Yet the presence of Hadrian's Wall beginning in 122 CE symbolized more than defense against northern tribes. It acknowledged limits. Rome recognized that complete cultural assimilation of the entire island was neither necessary nor efficient. The empire preferred a secure boundary with regulated interaction rather than perpetual expansion into resistant highlands. South of the wall, Roman identity deepened among elites. Inscriptions honor local magistrates with Roman names and titles. Participation in imperial cult ceremonies signaled alignment with central authority. Public spaces, forums, bathhouses, amphitheaters became theaters of shared civic ritual. These spaces normalized imperial hierarchy within daily life. Still, the memory of violent conquest remained embedded beneath civic order. Mass graves from the destruction layers of 60 to 61 CE were not erased from soil. Reconstruction built over trauma. Archaeology reveals burned debris beneath later stone structures, physical testimony to the rupture that had nearly severed Rome's hold. Over generations, narratives shifted. For Romans, the revolt affirmed military supremacy after temporary shock. For Britons, particularly in regions less fully Romanized, Boudica may have endured as a symbol of ancestral defiance. Oral traditions likely evolved, reshaping her image across time. Though we lack direct Celtic records, the persistence of later medieval references suggests that her story did not vanish entirely from cultural memory. Strategically, the revolt had another long-term consequence. It tempered imperial arrogance in peripheral administration. While Rome remained capable of severe repression elsewhere, provincial governors operated under closer scrutiny regarding fiscal conduct. An uprising that destroyed 3 cities could not be dismissed as routine disturbance. The empire's broader geopolitical posture during the 2nd century, marked by consolidation under emperors such as Trajan and Hadrian, favored stability over reckless annexation in already held territories. Britannia fit this philosophy. It was maintained, fortified, economically integrated, but not subjected again to the type of abrupt administrative aggression that had sparked rebellion. Over nearly 4 centuries of Roman presence, Britannia evolved into a hybrid society. Latin coexisted with Brittonic speech. Roman law intersected with customary practices. Military service offered pathways to mobility. The province produced officers and administrators who served beyond the island, embedding Britannia into imperial circulation. Yet the origins of this integration were rooted in trauma. The flogging of a queen and assault upon her daughters had triggered a chain reaction that reshaped imperial governance. The brutality intended to intimidate had forced Rome to reconsider how it projected authority among allied elites. In the final analysis, Boudica's defeat did not erase her impact. It compelled adaptation within the very system that crushed her uprising. Rome survived because it could learn. Empires that fail to adjust to their own excess often fracture. Rome recalibrated. Britannia remained under Roman rule until the early 5th century, long after the generation that witnessed the revolt had faded into anonymity. Roads, walls, and towns endured beyond imperial withdrawal. But beneath stone foundations lay the memory of a moment when a provincial queen forced the empire to confront its vulnerability. The punishment that began as an assertion of dominance ultimately redefined the architecture of Roman power on the island. By the middle of the 2nd century, the revolt of 60 to 61 CE had receded from immediate memory, but its structural consequences remained embedded in the province's design. Britannia was no longer governed as a tentative acquisition. It functioned as a fortified, administratively mature frontier whose stability rested on layered control rather than symbolic intimidation. The Roman military presence evolved accordingly. Legionary bases at key locations formed the backbone of security, but auxiliaries increasingly handled day-to-day patrol and frontier enforcement. These non-citizen troops, recruited from distant regions of the empire, reduced the possibility of local sympathies influencing discipline. Their service contracts tied personal advancement directly to imperial loyalty. Upon discharge, many received citizenship and land, further binding them to Roman order. This system reflected an institutional memory of how quickly localized grievance could metastasize into widespread rebellion. The earlier uprising had not been crushed by isolated heroics, but by disciplined cohesion and strategic positioning. Rome internalized that lesson. Training intensified. Supply logistics became more resilient. Communication networks were streamlined so that no governor would again be caught as exposed as Suetonius had been while campaigning in Mona. Hadrian's Wall, completed in stages during the 120s, crystallized the strategic transformation. Its construction was not merely defensive. It was administrative geometry imposed upon landscape. Mile castles, turrets, and forts punctuated its length, creating a rhythm of surveillance. Movement across the frontier required negotiation at controlled gates. The wall symbolized a mature empire choosing containment over reckless extension. South of this boundary, Roman Britain developed a complex provincial identity. Urbanization deepened. Londinium expanded as a commercial and administrative center, linked by sea routes to Gaul and the Rhineland. Public buildings reflected confidence in long-term occupation. Stone basilicas, baths, and temples were not temporary installations. They were generational commitments. Yet the empire never dismantled its precautionary posture. Garrisons remained substantial. Troop rotations continued. Intelligence networks persisted within tribal territories beyond the wall. The rebellion of Boudica had shown that cultural integration did not eliminate the potential for unified resistance if grievance aligned with opportunity. Economically, Britannia became increasingly valuable. Mining operations in regions such as Wales extracted lead and silver for imperial use. Agricultural estates supplied grain and livestock. Trade networks connected provincial producers to continental markets. Wealth circulated, and with it came vested interest in peace. Prosperity under Roman rule was uneven but tangible, particularly among elites who aligned themselves with imperial structures. Cultural assimilation operated through daily experience rather than decree. Children of local aristocrats were educated in Latin rhetoric. Military veterans married into local families. Religious practices fused. Temples dedicated to Roman gods incorporated Celtic iconography. Syncretism allowed continuity without overt resistance. Rome understood that domination sustained through partial inclusion was more stable than rule imposed solely by fear. Still, the empire maintained its capacity for swift repression. Records from other provinces demonstrate Rome's willingness to annihilate insurrection when necessary. Britannia's relative calm in the 2nd century was not evidence of universal contentment, but of calculated deterrence. The memory of devastation in 60 to 61 CE remained an unspoken boundary. Politically, the province underwent administrative refinement. Eventually divided into multiple provinces in the late 3rd century to prevent concentration of power, Britannia's governance structure reflected broader imperial reforms responding to frontier pressures. While these later divisions occurred long after Boudica's revolt, they emerged within a lineage of lessons about provincial vulnerability. The psychological dimension of Roman rule matured as well. Public displays of authority became ritualized rather than improvisational. Ceremonies honoring emperors reinforced hierarchy. Legal proceedings enacted Roman justice visibly but procedurally. The chaotic humiliation that had sparked rebellion was replaced by institutional order. Power remained absolute, but it operated through predictable channels. Across generations, the original trauma transformed into historical memory rather than immediate grievance. Communities rebuilt. Markets thrived where ash once lay. Children grew up within Roman civic frameworks without personal recollection of pre-conquest autonomy. The longer imperial stability endured, the more distant the revolt appeared. Yet imperial stability was never absolute. In the later 3rd century, Britannia would again experience instability during broader imperial crises, including breakaway regimes such as the Gallic Empire. These episodes, however, differed fundamentally from Boudica's uprising. They were products of imperial fragmentation rather than indigenous mass revolt against initial conquest. The nature of resistance had changed. It was no longer tribal coalition against foreign occupier, but provincial participation in imperial power struggles. This evolution underscores the depth of transformation triggered by the events of 60 to 61 CE. The rebellion forced Rome to abandon illusions about soft occupation. In its place emerged a province structurally integrated into imperial defense, economy, and identity. Britannia shifted from uncertain annex to entrenched frontier. The ultimate withdrawal of Roman administration in the early 5th century resulted from continental pressures and internal collapse, not from a resurgence of the type of tribal coalition Boudica once led. By that time, Roman Britain had existed for nearly 4 centuries. The society left behind bore little resemblance to the fragmented landscape that had erupted in revolt. The punishment inflicted upon Boudica and her family was meant to extinguish resistance through humiliation. Instead, it revealed the volatility of dishonored sovereignty. Rome survived the consequence by adapting, fortifying its frontiers, moderating administrative excess, and weaving local elites into its hierarchy. Empires endure not by avoiding error, but by absorbing its lessons into structure. In Britannia, the scars of rebellion hardened into roads, walls, and civic institutions. Violence became regulated. Authority became architectural. The queen who rose against Rome did not live to see this transformation. But the system that crushed her would carry the imprint of her revolt long after her name faded from official record. By the late 2nd century, Roman Britain stood as a province that appeared stable, even routine within the imperial system. Yet stability on a frontier was never static. It required constant reinforcement, both materially and psychologically. The shadow of the great uprising decades earlier did not dictate daily governance, but it lingered in institutional reflex. The Roman army in Britannia adapted to a rhythm of vigilance. Units stationed along Hadrian's Wall conducted patrols not only to repel incursions from northern tribes, but to maintain visible authority among communities living in proximity to the frontier. Military drills, standardized equipment, and architectural regularity communicated the same message year after year. Rome was permanent. Permanence was itself a deterrent. This projection of endurance contrasted sharply with the volatility of 60 to 61 CE. Then, Roman settlements had been isolated nodes vulnerable to coordinated assault. Now, the landscape was networked. Forts were spaced within signaling distance. Roads allowed rapid redeployment. Supply depots reduced dependence on any single route. The province functioned as an integrated grid rather than scattered enclaves. Civic life expanded within this secured framework. Town councils operated under Roman municipal law. Local magistrates oversaw taxation and public works. Participation in these structures offered prestige and influence. For provincial elites, integration into Roman civic identity proved more advantageous than nostalgic allegiance to fragmented tribal autonomy. Yet integration did not erase cultural memory. In rural areas especially, indigenous traditions persisted in burial customs, art motifs, and religious observance. The empire tolerated these continuities so long as they did not crystallize into organized resistance. The earlier revolt had demonstrated how cultural networks could mobilize quickly if grievance aligned with charismatic leadership. Roman policy after Boudica, therefore, favored fragmentation of potential unity. Administrative boundaries sometimes divided tribal territories. This stability did not imply absence of tension. Rural fortifications expanded in some areas, suggesting localized insecurity. Villas in certain regions show signs of fortification or abandonment during periods of unrest. But these fluctuations corresponded to broader imperial instability rather than coordinated resistance against Roman occupation as such. The psychological landscape had shifted permanently. By the 3rd century, multiple generations had lived entirely within Roman political culture. Latin inscriptions were commonplace. Civic administration operated in familiar patterns. Military service connected Britons to distant provinces. Identity had layered. Tribal affiliations persisted, yet Roman citizenship and legal status defined daily life for many. The empire's response to 3rd century fragmentation reinforced centralization in subsequent reforms. Under emperors such as Diocletian in the late 3rd century, administrative reorganization divided larger provinces into smaller units to prevent concentration of power. Britannia was subdivided accordingly. This restructuring, while driven by empire-wide concerns, resonated with earlier provincial experience. Concentrated authority in distant hands could produce volatility. Distributed governance enhanced oversight. Military reforms also reflected accumulated frontier experience. Mobile field armies supplemented fixed garrisons, allowing rapid response to incursions. Britannia benefited from this layered defense. Coastal fortifications known today as Saxon shore forts were constructed in the late 3rd and early 4th centuries to counter seaborne raiders. These installations illustrate adaptive strategy, anticipating threats before they coalesced into existential crises. The comparison to the earlier revolt remains instructive. In 60 CE, Rome reacted after humiliation and devastation. In the 3rd and 4th centuries, it increasingly sought to preempt destabilization through surveillance, fortification, and administrative segmentation. The province that once nearly slipped from imperial grasp became a laboratory for sustained defensive governance. Culturally, late Roman Britain exhibited both continuity and transformation. Christianity began to take root by the 4th century, adding new layers to religious identity. Urban centers maintained forums and basilicas, though some showed signs of economic contraction. The blending of Roman and local traditions persisted, creating a society neither wholly Roman nor wholly pre-Roman, but something distinct. Yet the empire's overall decline eventually altered Britannia's trajectory. Pressures along continental frontiers demanded redeployment of troops. As the Western Empire weakened in the early 5th century, imperial support for distant provinces faltered. Communication with Rome diminished. Military units once stationed permanently were withdrawn or left unsupported. When Roman administration effectively ended in Britannia around 410 CE, the withdrawal was not accompanied by a dramatic indigenous uprising comparable to Boudica's rebellion. Instead, it unfolded as a gradual erosion of central authority. Local leaders assumed responsibility for defense and governance. The imperial superstructure receded. This quiet departure contrasts starkly with the violent rupture of the 1st century. The brutality inflicted upon Boudica had ignited explosive resistance because Rome was still an intrusive conqueror. For centuries later, Rome was no longer an external shock, but a foundational layer of society. Its absence created uncertainty rather than liberation. Archaeological evidence from the post-Roman transition suggests adaptation rather than immediate collapse. Some urban centers contracted, others shifted function. Villas were abandoned or repurposed. Material culture simplified. Yet the infrastructure, roads, walls, town grids, remained embedded in landscape long after imperial officials vanished. In retrospect, the revolt of 60 to 61 CE stands as the crucible in which Roman Britain's long-term character was forged. The near loss of the province compelled a transformation from opportunistic annexation to fortified integration. That integration proved resilient enough to endure centuries of imperial fluctuation. The punishment intended to crush a widow's authority had exposed imperial vulnerability. Rome responded not with retreat, but with recalibrated dominance. Measured, infrastructural, persistent. Over generations, that recalibration reshaped identity, economy, and governance on the island soil. When the empire finally withdrew, it left behind a province irrevocably altered by both conquest and adaptation. The flames that once consumed its cities had long since cooled, but their imprint had determined the architecture of everything that followed. By the 4th century, the memory of Boudica's uprising had drifted from lived experience into recorded history, preserved primarily in Roman texts rather than in active political consciousness. Britannia had become one province among many in a vast but increasingly strained empire. Yet the structural DNA of its governance still bore the imprint of that early crisis. Imperial administration in late Roman Britain operated within a complex hierarchy refined through centuries of frontier management. Civil authority and military command were increasingly separated to prevent concentrated power. Provincial governors oversaw taxation and legal matters, while military commanders controlled troops stationed along walls and coasts. This division reflected empire-wide reforms, but in Britannia it resonated with a long-standing lesson that unchecked authority could produce destabilizing excess. Urban life continued, though signs of contraction appeared. Some public buildings fell into disrepair. Investment shifted toward defensive architecture. Town walls were reinforced, gates narrowed, towers heightened. The emphasis had turned inward. Security overshadowed expansion. This defensive posture echoed earlier adaptations following the Great Revolt. When vulnerability became visible, Rome built in stone. Along the northern frontier, Hadrian's Wall remained active, though its maintenance fluctuated with imperial resources. In some sectors, forts were refurbished. In others, occupancy thinned. To the south and east, the chain of coastal fortifications known as the Saxon shore system guarded against maritime raiders. These forts, massive, thick-walled, strategically placed, were physical manifestations of a province accustomed to vigilance. The threats faced in the 4th century differed from those of Boudica's era. They were not unified tribal rebellions rooted in dynastic insult, but mobile incursions by Picts, Scots, and seaborne groups from continental shores. The Roman response emphasized rapid containment rather than punitive devastation. Field armies, capable of movement across provinces, supplemented static defenses. The architecture of control had matured from reactive suppression to anticipatory management. Culturally, Roman Britain in this period exhibited deep hybridization. Latin inscriptions coexisted with persistent local artistic motifs. Christianity spread gradually, adding ecclesiastical structures to urban landscapes. Bishops from Britannia are recorded as attending continental councils in the 4th century, evidence of ecclesiastical integration into broader imperial networks. Religious affiliation, once a focal point of resistance when Druids were targeted, now functioned within Roman-sanctioned frameworks. Yet beneath visible structures, imperial cohesion frayed. The Western empires struggled with fiscal instability and military overextension. Troops were redeployed to confront crises closer to Rome's heartlands. Britannia, distant and resource-intensive to defend, felt the strain. Garrisons became underfunded. Supply lines thinned. Even so, there was no resurgence of a mass insurrection comparable to that led by Boudica. The social fabric had altered too profoundly. Generations raised under Roman law and commerce did not perceive imperial presence as a recent imposition. Land ownership, taxation, and civic identity were embedded within Roman systems. Resistance, where it occurred, took form as localized power struggles rather than ideological rejection of Roman rule. In the early 5th century, imperial authority effectively withdrew. Communications between Britain and central administration weakened. A rescript attributed to Emperor Honorius around 410 CE advised Britons to look to their own defense. Whether this directive was formal or symbolic, it marked a turning point. The province that had once nearly been lost to rebellion now drifted from imperial orbit through administrative exhaustion. The withdrawal was not accompanied by dramatic siege or ceremonial expulsion. It unfolded gradually. Military units either departed or assimilated locally. Civic administration faltered as imperial tax collection ceased. Urban centers contracted further. Yet the infrastructure remained. Roads, walls, and town plans did not vanish. They persisted as skeletal reminders of centuries of occupation. In this quiet dissolution, the contrast with 60 to 61 CE is stark. Then, Roman power faced a unified indigenous uprising born from humiliation and abrupt annexation. In the 5th century, no such unified movement rose to expel Rome. Instead, imperial retreat created a vacuum filled by local leaders adapting to new realities. The province's transformation was complete, from conquered territory to integrated frontier to post-imperial society shaped by Roman inheritance. The long arc from Boudica's punishment to Rome's withdrawal illustrates how a single act of administrative brutality can trigger structural change far beyond its immediate context. The flogging of a queen was intended as a display of unquestioned dominance. It exposed a miscalculation in understanding local sovereignty. The revolt that followed forced Rome to recalibrate governance, embed military permanence, and refine its methods of control. Over centuries, those refinements created a province resilient enough to endure imperial turbulence without reverting to the pattern of mass tribal revolt. By the time Rome departed, Britannia had internalized imperial systems deeply enough that their removal produced fragmentation, not liberation. Archaeological layers capture this continuity. Burn layers from the 1st century revolt lie beneath later Roman construction. Above them, evidence of 4th century contraction. Each stratum records adaptation to pressure, first explosive, then incremental. Boudica's own fate remains obscure by time. Roman historians record that she took poison after defeat. No confirmed burial, no indigenous chronicle, no monument from her contemporary survives. Yet the consequences of the events surrounding her humiliation are etched into the province's transformation. They reshaped not only military policy, but imperial psychology. Rome's power in Britannia was never again casual. It became procedural, infrastructural, vigilant. The empire that once relied on symbolic punishment evolved into one that relied on architectural permanence and bureaucratic oversight. When that empire finally receded, it left behind a landscape permanently altered by both violence and adaptation, a testament to how a moment of brutality can reverberate across centuries of governance. In the end, there was no monument raised by Rome to commemorate the punishment of Boudica. Empires do not memorialize their miscalculations. They absorb them. The events that began with the public flogging of a client queen and the violation of her daughters did not end with her death on a battlefield or by poison. They unfolded across 4 centuries of provincial governance, military architecture, administrative reform, and cultural transformation. What appeared at first as an isolated act of provincial brutality became a catalyst that reshaped how Rome held the edge of its world. When Prasutagus died and his kingdom was annexed, Roman officials likely believed they were enforcing policy consistent with imperial law. Client arrangements had limits. Debts were to be collected. Authority was to be asserted. In their calculation, the humiliation of Boudica was disciplinary theater. Visible dominance meant to extinguish dissent before it formed. Instead, it revealed the limits of coercion detached from legitimacy. The revolt that followed was not the largest Rome ever faced. It did not threaten the imperial heartland, but in Britannia, it came closer to unraveling Roman control than any external invasion would for centuries. 3 major settlements burned. Thousands died. A provincial administration collapsed temporarily under coordinated resistance. The Roman response demonstrated the empire's most enduring trait, adaptive severity. Suetonius Paulinus crushed the uprising through tactical discipline and strategic terrain selection. Afterward, Rome recalibrated. Financial excess was moderated. Military distribution was strengthened. Infrastructure multiplied. Client kingship receded in favor of direct oversight. From that recalibration emerged a different kind of occupation, less theatrical, more systemic. Stone replaced timber. Roads laced the countryside. Forts stood at calculated intervals. Hadrian's wall cut across northern terrain not only as defense, but as declaration. Rome would define its boundary and enforce it with permanence. Administrative reforms divided authority to prevent unchecked exploitation. Provincial elites were absorbed through citizenship and civic office rather than threatened through spectacle. In this transformation, the province that once nearly slipped away became one of the empire's most fortified frontiers. The rebellion's memory lingered as a caution embedded in policy. Brutality would still be used, but it would be regulated, purposeful, and buffered by bureaucracy. Over generations, the society that emerged in Britannia bore the layered imprint of conquest. Latin inscriptions stood beside indigenous motifs. Villas rose above land once scarred by ash. Trade networks connected the island to continental markets. Military service bound local families to imperial command structures. The raw antagonism of annexation softened into structured coexistence. Yet coexistence did not erase origin. Archaeological strata preserve the rupture. Beneath later Roman construction lie the charred remains of Londinium and Camulodunum. Those layers are not abstract history. They are physical testimony to the moment imperial arrogance collided with local sovereignty. When the Western Empire began to fracture in the 4th and early 5th centuries, Britannia did not reenact Boudica's rebellion. There was no mass tribal coalition rising to expel Roman vengeance for ancient humiliation. Instead, imperial authority thinned gradually. Troops were redeployed. Communication faltered. Local leaders assumed responsibility for defense. Rome receded not in flames, but in administrative silence. This quiet withdrawal underscores the magnitude of the earlier transformation. By the time imperial governance ended around 410 CE, Roman systems had become structural rather than external. Their removal created vacuum, not liberation. The province had been irrevocably altered. Boudica herself remains a figure filtered entirely through Roman narrative. Tacitus presents her as formidable yet doomed. Cassius Dio adds dramatic detail shaped by later rhetorical conventions. No Celtic chronicle survives to present her voice. Her daughter's fate vanishes from record entirely. The individuals at the center of the crisis dissolve into silence. But the consequences of what was done to them did not dissolve. The punishment inflicted upon Boudica was designed to reinforce hierarchy. It revealed instead that humiliation of allied elites could unify disparate tribes with startling speed. Rome survived the backlash because it possessed institutional resilience, professional legions, logistical depth, and capacity for reform. Not all empires would have adapted so effectively. The long-term geopolitical impact extended beyond Britannia. The revolt became an example within Roman historiography of the dangers inherent in provincial mismanagement. It reinforced the principle that conquest required calibrated authority. Excessive greed endangered stability. Measured integration ensured durability. In the broader sweep of imperial history, Boudica's uprising occupies a paradoxical space. It was a defeat for the Britons, yet it forced the empire to refine its frontier doctrine. It failed militarily, yet reshaped governance for centuries. It began with personal violation, yet its repercussions were structural. Measured historical intensity reveals a consistent pattern. When empire mistakes domination for legitimacy, resistance becomes existential. When empire learns to bind rather than merely break, it endures longer. Rome endured in Britannia for nearly 400 years after the rebellion. Roads outlasted legions. Walls outlasted emperors. Town grids persisted beneath later settlements. The architectural legacy of adaptation survived even imperial collapse. The brutality meant to silence a queen did not silence the island. It transformed it, and in that transformation, the empire that punished her was changed as well.